In this video, we'll be looking at how you can utilize grids in your Mimic design. Grids allow you to create a flexible layout that responds to different widths and heights. First, let's quickly discuss the main differences between a canvas and a grid. Unlike canvases, grids are designed to provide a flexible, dynamic experience. Primarily, a grid will use the margin of an element to determine its size rather than a width and height. This is useful for any type of UI that needs to have its layout adjusted automatically, such as a form. However, it is possible to use a width and height for positioning inside a grid. To demonstrate this, let's create a Mimic with a grid root now. Then, let's add a rectangle to this grid. The first thing you'll probably notice is that this rectangle has some adorners on each side of it. Currently, the top and left sides are anchored to the sides of the grid. This means that regardless of how big or small the grid becomes, those sides of the rectangle must always maintain that distance from the grid edge. This distance is controlled by the margin property. See how this works when I resize the grid? The margin on the top and the left stay the same regardless of the grid size, and the width and the height of the rectangle aren't changing. Now, let's enable anchoring on the right and bottom sides of the rectangle, then resize the grid again. Notice that both the width and the height of the rectangle are now changing. Since we anchored all four sides, the rectangle size is set to auto and its size is being controlled by the margin property. You can also add columns and rows to help define how your layout will flow. There's a couple of ways you can add columns and rows to your grid. They can be added by clicking the green arrows in the top right and bottom left of your grid. You can also right-click and bring up a context menu that has some options for adding columns and rows. In addition, columns and rows can also be added through the Properties panel. In there, there's two options you'll be able to select: column definitions and row definitions. When I click on the column definitions button, a dialog appears showing some options that can be used to set the number of columns you want to have in your grid. Now that we've got another column, we're probably going to want to resize it. This can be done a couple of different ways. You can edit the sizing in this dialog here, or if you want, you can simply close the dialog, then grab the column or row indicator and drag it like this. There's also an option in the context menu for setting the column width and row height. Before we change any of the sizing, let's talk about the different types of sizing you can use. Grid columns and rows can be sized three different ways: star, auto, and pixel. To help demonstrate this, I've set up a Mimic using each of these sizing modes. As we can see, this grid has 4 columns with various size modes set. So let's take a closer look at what each one of these does and how they behave. The numbers in each column signify the importance of the sizing type when the grid is working out the size for each column. The highest priority size type is pixels. If you have any columns using this mode, the size for the column or columns using it will be calculated before anything else. After that, any columns or rows using the automatic size mode will be calculated, and then finally all of the columns or rows using star sizing will be calculated based on what's left. In this grid's case, there's 3 star units in our grid and 300 pixels of width left over after the other 2 size types are calculated, so that 300 pixels of space will be divided by 3 to get 100 pixels per star unit. In cases where you don't have some of these size modes, the priority for each one is shifted accordingly. For example, if we didn't have this pixel-sized column, the automatic size column would be the highest priority size when the grid layout is updated. Now let's talk about column and row spanning, so we'll go ahead and close this example Mimic. In grids, it's possible to make elements use more than one column or row. If I select this rectangle, then switch to the Properties tab and click the Advanced Options button, you'll see some properties for setting the column and row, and then the column span and row span. Setting the column and row properties will let you change which column or row the element is in. The first column and row always start with the number 0, and each additional column or row will increment this number by 1. Column span and row span set the number of columns or row the element should use. For example, if I set the column span to 2 on this rectangle, you can see that it's now using both of the columns in our grid. Finally, let's take a look at some important things to remember. With grids, you can put anything inside them, including other grids. In the toolbox under the Grids and Panels group, there's an option for adding a grid to your design surface. If I add this grid, I can then do anything I want with it. I can anchor it, and I can also edit it and add columns and rows to it, or even place objects inside of it. Be careful with this though. It's easy to get confused in your design flows, so you'll need to make sure that you pay attention to what's happening in your Mimic if you choose to do this. Before we end this video, let's take a look at a Mimic that I've got saved in the model. This is a sample of some UI that B-Scada has developed for an internal defect tracking software, and as you can see, it makes great use of a grid. Not only are we using a grid as the root type, but we've got some nested grids inside this as well. If I exit the editing mode for this nested grid, then resize the root grid, we can see this flexible dynamic experience that we spoke about earlier. In closing, Status Enterprise is a powerful, easy-to-use tool that lets you design once and deploy multiple times. For more information about Status Enterprise and Mimic design, please visit us on the web at www.scada.com.